The silent protector. The spaceport of Surfera was alive with energy, a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds that echoed through the grand halls. Ships of every shape and size hovered in the docking bays, sending out a soft hum as they prepared to depart for distant stars. The air was thick with the scents of alien spices, strange perfumes, and the occasional burst of industrial fuel from the nearby refueling stations. It was a crossroads of galaxies, a place where species from across the cosmos converged for trade, diplomacy, and exploration. In the midst of this chaotic scene, Laia stood as a figure of serene beauty. Her long, shimmering silver hair cascaded down her back like a river of stardust, catching the dim light from the overhead lamps and reflecting it with an ethereal glow. Her amethyst eyes, large and expressive, scanned the bustling crowd before her, but no one took notice. She was used to this. It wasn't that she lacked beauty, far from it, but something about her presence was isolating. Laia had been born into the high ranks of her people, her race known for its grace and otherworldly beauty. Yet, despite her undeniable allure, she walked alone. The cause of this was not her features, but rather the beast that followed her, a massive, intimidating creature that few dared approach. Zion, a dren, was a rare species of alien beast, known for its size and ferocity. To the untrained eye, Zion looked like nothing more than a terrifying predator. Its gleaming white fur, razor-sharp claws, and piercing emerald eyes struck fear into the hearts of any who crossed its path. But Laia knew better. Zion had been with her since he was a cub, growing alongside her as both protector and companion. He was not just a pet. Zion was her confidant, her only true friend in a world full of distant faces. She had raised him herself, learning the art of communication with him as one would with a partner. And despite his fearsome exterior, Zion had a gentle soul, one that only Laia had the privilege to see. Yet, for all his loyalty and affection, Zion had a tendency to make others retreat in fear. Wherever Laia went, Zion followed closely, padding beside her with a slow, measured gait, his presence commanding attention. Other aliens, particularly the males, would glance nervously at the beast before swiftly looking away, their desire to approach Laia vanishing as soon as they saw Zion. It was as though the creature itself was a shield, keeping the world at bay. The loneliness weighed heavily on Laia's heart. She longed for a companion, someone who would see her not just as the keeper of a deadly beast, but as the woman she truly was. Someone who could understand that Zion, despite his size and strength, was no monster. He was a creature of deep affection, his loyalty unwavering. She often found herself watching other pairs, male and female, laughing and talking, their bonds clear as day, and wondered what it would feel like to be part of something like that. But for all her longing, Laia never dared to hope. She had tried to form connections before, but it always ended the same way. The fear was too strong. Her people, with their intricate traditions and elegant ways, had no place for someone like her, a woman bound to a beast of such fearsome reputation. As she walked through the crowded spaceport, Zion by her side, Laia couldn't help but feel the pang of loneliness gnawing at her. The whispers that followed her wherever she went, the glances of fear or disgust from the passing crowds, the isolation. It was all too familiar. She longed for someone who would look beyond Zion's terrifying form and see the gentle soul within, just as she did. But every time, without fail, her hopes were dashed. Zion, sensing her discomfort, let out a low rumble, his massive head turning toward her with a quiet whine. His emerald eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, the two shared a connection that only they understood. Laia placed a hand on his broad shoulder, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. "It's okay, Zion," she whispered softly. "We're fine. I don't need them. I have you." And yet, despite her assurances, Laia felt a deep emptiness settle inside her, the familiar ache of isolation creeping into her heart once again. She didn't want to be just the woman with the beast. She wanted more, a connection that was her own. As Laia turned the corner of the terminal, Her eyes were drawn to a figure standing near the docking gate. It was a human, a soldier by the looks of his attire. His stance was confident, purposeful, his blue eyes scanning the area with practiced precision. But what caught her attention wasn't just the human's military bearing, nor the sharp cut of his jawline, or the rugged look in his eyes. It was the fact that, despite the massive Dren standing by her side, this human did not shrink away in fear. Most would have immediately turned and walked in the opposite direction, frightened by the Dren's intimidating presence. But this human, he merely paused, his gaze flickering for a moment to Zion, then back to Laya, and then he smiled. It was the first time in a long while that Laya had seen anyone look at her like that, without fear, without disgust, just a smile. The warmth in his expression was palpable, and for a moment, Laya's breath caught in her chest. What was this feeling? Could it be possible? The human began to approach, his stride unwavering as he made his way through the crowd, moving with purpose but also with an undeniable sense of calm. Laya instinctively stepped back, her hand tightening on Zion's leash. But the beast, sensing the tension in her, remained perfectly still, his emerald eyes watching the human closely. As the man drew closer, Laya could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her. She had expected him to turn away, just like the others. But he didn't. Instead, the human stopped just a few feet from her, a curious glint in his eyes. His gaze flicked down to Zion, and to her complete surprise, he knelt. "Hey there, big fella," the human said in a low, soothing voice, his hand extended toward Zion, as though greeting an old friend. Zion's eyes narrowed for a moment, studying the human with a mix of curiosity and wariness. But then, something unexpected happened. The beast slowly lowered its massive head, sniffing the human's hand. His whiskers twitched, and for the first time in years, Laya saw something she had never witnessed before, Jen nuzzling the human's hand. A deep purr rumbled from Zion's chest, and Laya's heart skipped a beat. The human chuckled, his hand gently scratching behind the beast's ears, as though he were petting a house cat. Laya stood frozen in place, her heart racing in disbelief. Had this really just happened? No one had ever dared to approach Zion like this before, let alone touch him with such ease. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir deep within her, a flicker of hope. And then, as if sensing her gaze, the human looked up. His eyes locked with hers, and for a brief electric moment, everything else around them disappeared. The crowd, the spaceport, the noise. It all faded into the background. In that instant, there was only the human's blue eyes, steady and kind, and Laya's racing heart. A warmth spread through her chest, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Could this be the start of something new? Something that wasn't defined by fear or isolation? With that thought lingering in her mind, Laya took a tentative step forward, Zion still at her side. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to hope the bond forged in silence. The spaceport of Surfera had always been a place of constant motion, but today, for Laya, the world seemed to move in slow motion. Grayson Hamilton's smile lingered in her mind, a beacon in the midst of her usually solitary existence. The human's sudden kindness had stirred something in her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. Hope. But hope was a dangerous thing for someone like her. Laya had learned long ago to protect her heart, to guard it from the disappointment of rejection. Yet here she was, feeling something she had never thought she would. A connection to someone who had shown no fear of Zion, her constant, terrifying companion. Zion, too, seemed to sense the shift. The once aloof and fiercely protective beast was calmer, his massive form still beside Laya, as they slowly walked through the crowded spaceport, their movements unhurried. The Dren's emerald eyes flicked to Grayson now and then, but there was no tension, no growl, just a quiet acknowledgement. Zion had allowed Grayson to approach him without hesitation, a sign of respect, even for a creature so feared by most. Laia couldn't help but marvel at the fact that Jian had reacted to this human differently. To her surprise, the bond between Jian and Grayson had felt natural. The crowds parted as the two moved through the spaceport, their pace slow but deliberate. Laia had never thought to trust anyone else with Zion, but Grayson had earned her curiosity. She had never encountered someone so unaffected by Zion's presence. Every other soul who had seen Zion, with his massive frame and gleaming claws, had recoiled in terror. Yet Grayson, he had approached with calm assurance, an understanding that was almost otherworldly. Still, despite the warmth she felt growing inside her, Laia couldn't bring herself to approach him again. Not yet. She hesitated, unsure of what the encounter had meant. Grayson was a soldier, a human soldier, and Laia knew better than to think someone like him would be interested in a woman like her. She was an alien, strange, and unfamiliar, and her world was nothing like the one he belonged to. Humans had their own kind. They had their own lives, their own worlds. She was an outsider. But she couldn't ignore the way Grayson had looked at her, as if he saw her for who she truly was, and not just as a woman walking with a fearsome beast. The thought lingered in her mind as she continued to move through the spaceport, with Jian by her side and her thoughts occupied by the human soldier. The soldier's secret. Grayson Hamilton was not a man who easily showed his emotions, especially in public. His life as a soldier had taught him to suppress his feelings, to keep his thoughts and desires to himself. But there was something about Laia that had shaken him. He couldn't explain it, but when their eyes met, something inside him had shifted. It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet strength in her demeanor, and the connection she had with Zion. Zion, the massive creature, was unlike anything Grayson had ever seen. Its size and power were formidable, but the way it had nuzzled his hand without hesitation spoke volumes. The Dren wasn't just a beast, it was a being of intelligence and emotion. Grayson understood that much, and for the first time in his life, he felt the undeniable pull of curiosity about Laia. He wanted to know her, wanted to understand the bond she shared with Zion. But more than that, Grayson found himself inexplicably drawn to her. There was something in her that resonated with him, something he couldn't ignore. As a soldier, he was trained to read people, to assess situations, and to make quick decisions based on logic. But when it came to Laia, he found himself in uncharted territory. He couldn't simply walk away from her. Not after their brief encounter, not after the way she had looked at him. He had to know more. But he also knew that moving forward meant stepping into unknown territory, where his military training would be of little use. Grayson had no idea what his future with Laia would look like, but he felt an undeniable urge to find out. And as he watched her move through the crowd with Zion at her side, he realized that this wasn't just about a chance encounter, it was the beginning of something much larger. The unexpected invitation. It wasn't long before Grayson's opportunity to act presented itself. A few days after their initial meeting in the spaceport, Grayson found himself at a local cafe, a quiet place away from the crowds where he could think. He had been reviewing intelligence reports when he noticed someone at the far end of the room. There, standing near the entrance, was Laia. This time, she wasn't alone. Zion, as always, was by her side, its massive form partially hidden behind a pillar. Grayson's heart skipped a beat at the sight of her. She wasn't looking at him, but her presence was impossible to ignore. There was something about the way she carried herself, as if she was waiting for something, or someone. Grayson stood up without thinking. He moved toward her, his boots silent on the floor. As he approached, Laia looked up, her amethyst eyes meeting his with a mixture of surprise and wariness. Zion's emerald eyes followed Grayson's every move, but the Dren didn't make a sound. It was as if the creature sensed that this was a moment of significance, something far beyond the ordinary exchanges that Laia had encountered in her life. Grayson cleared his throat, unsure of how to approach her. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said softly, keeping his tone casual. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but the words came naturally. He knew she wasn't here by accident. There was something in her presence that called to him, a force he couldn't explain. Laia regarded him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. The tension in the air was palpable, but it wasn't the kind of tension Grayson had experienced in combat. No, this was different. This was something deeper, something personal. Finally, Laia spoke, her voice hesitant but steady. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again," she admitted, her words soft, as though testing the waters. You weren't like the others." Grayson smiled gently, feeling an unexpected warmth spreading through him. "I'm not like the others," he replied. "And I don't scare easily, especially not when it comes to a beautiful woman and her pet." Laia's expression softened, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Zion is not just a pet," she said, her voice quieter now, more serious. "He's my protector, my only family. Most people don't understand that." Grayson nodded. "I can tell," he said, his voice low. "There's a bond between you two, something real. I respect that." The silence between them grew, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new, something that neither of them fully understood yet. Grayson took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'd like to know more about you, Laia," he said quietly. "About Zion, about your life. If you'll let me." For the first time in a long while, Laia felt her walls start to crumble. She had never allowed anyone close, never allowed herself to hope for something more. But as she looked at Grayson, genuine, fearless, and kind, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Trust. "I think I'd like that too," she whispered, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. And so, a new chapter began, for both Laia and Grayson, one that would change their lives forever, and one that would bridge the gap between two worlds that had never truly met before. The path unfolds. The days following their chance encounter were a blur for Laia. Grayson's presence lingered in her thoughts long after their brief conversation at the cafe. She had never been one to easily trust, especially not after years of loneliness and rejection. But something about the human soldier, something in the quiet determination of his eyes and the warmth of his smile, made her feel as if there was more to this connection than mere coincidence. It wasn't long before Grayson reached out again. This time, it was not a chance meeting or a passing conversation. Grayson had taken the first step, sending Laia a message. He asked her to meet at a small park just outside the bustling center of Surfera. It was a quiet, secluded place, surrounded by towering trees that hummed with the energy of distant planets. Laia found the idea of meeting again both comforting and nerve-wracking. She hadn't allowed herself to trust anyone in so long, and yet here she was, drawn to someone who made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. A growing bond. The park was peaceful, and the soft breeze seemed to whisper secrets through the branches. Grayson was already there when Laia arrived, sitting on a stone bench, his gaze distant. As soon as he saw her approach, however, his eyes brightened with a warmth that seemed to draw her closer. Laia stood for a moment, watching him, unsure of what to do or say. But something about his steady gaze made her heart beat faster. "You came," Grayson said, standing up as she reached him. His voice was calm, but there was a sense of hope in his tone that Laia hadn't expected. "I did," Laia replied softly, feeling her own nervousness start to melt away in his presence. "I wasn't sure what to expect, but I wanted to see you again." A smile tugged at Grayson's lips as he gestured to the bench beside him. "Then sit with me. I'm glad you came." As Laia took a seat, Zion padded over and sat by her side, his large, looming form casting a shadow over the ground. Grayson's gaze shifted briefly to the Dren, but instead of fear, he met the creature's eyes with a calm understanding. "He's a lot more than a pet, isn't he?" Grayson asked, his voice full of respect. Laia nodded, looking down at the creature she had raised from a cub. "Zion is more than I could ever explain in words. He's my protector, my family, and my closest friend. He's all I've had, and all I've needed." Grayson watched her as she spoke, his expression softening. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't have a creature like Zion, but I do understand what it's like to rely on something or someone who has always been there." Laia glanced at him, her eyes searching his. "What do you mean?" she asked, genuinely curious. Grayson hesitated for a moment, but the vulnerability in Laia's eyes made him feel as though he could be honest. "I lost a lot when I was younger," he said, his voice soft, but filled with an undeniable strength. "I've seen war, I've lost people, and I've learned to rely on my training and my instincts. But it wasn't until I met someone who truly understood me, that I started to feel like I wasn't alone anymore." Laia's heart swelled with an unexpected emotion. It was rare for anyone to admit such things, let alone to a stranger. She looked down at Zion, feeling the warmth of the bond she shared with him, and then back up at Grayson. There was something about the way he spoke, the honesty in his eyes, that made her feel as though she wasn't as alone as she had once believed. A dangerous proposition. As the days went on, Laia and Grayson met more frequently, spending time together whenever their schedules allowed. At first, their conversations were cautious, tentative, but soon they began to open up to each other. Grayson told her about his past, about the battles he had fought, and about the people he had lost. Laia, in turn, shared her life with Zion, explaining how she had come to be alone on Surfera, how she had tried to find acceptance in a world that feared her companion. Their bond grew slowly but surely, built on mutual respect, understanding, and shared experiences. However, there was a growing tension in the background, one that neither of them could ignore. Despite the peaceful nature of their conversations, both knew that their lives were far from simple. Laia's connection to Zion was more than just an emotional one. It was a responsibility. And Grayson, a soldier, had duties of his own. The two worlds they inhabited were destined to collide, and they both understood that their bond might not be as easy to maintain as it seemed. One evening, as they walked through the outskirts of the spaceport together, Laia felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. "Grayson," she began, her voice hesitant, "I've been thinking. I know that we come from different worlds, and I know that Zion isn't just any creature. He's dangerous to those who don't understand him." Grayson looked at her with concern. "What are you trying to say?" Laia stopped walking, turning to face him. "I can't keep Zion hidden forever. He's a part of me, and he always will be. But there are those who would see him as a threat, who would want to use him, or worse, destroy him. I'm afraid of what might happen if we're discovered." Grayson's heart tightened at the thought of Laia losing the one thing that meant the most to her. "I won't let that happen," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. If they try to harm Zion, or you, they'll have to go through me." Laia's eyes searched his face, unsure whether to believe his words. "You don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "You're a soldier. You have a duty, a life beyond this. I can't ask you to be a part of this. The danger is too great." Grayson stepped closer, his presence solid and comforting. "I don't have to be asked, Laia. I want to be part of this. I want to be part of your world, no matter what it takes. I won't let fear or duty stand in the way of something real." The intensity of his words settled in Laia's chest, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make it work. That her bond with Grayson wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was something worth fighting for. A new resolve. Days turned into weeks, and Laia and Grayson continued to navigate their growing connection. They spent time exploring Surfera together, visiting quiet corners of the city where no one would judge them for their bond. Grayson never once flinched at Zion's presence, and in return, the Dren grew even more protective of him. It was clear to Laia that the relationship between Grayson and Zion was growing stronger. But the dangers were always lurking. Grayson's military mission was far from over, and Laia knew that the more time they spent together, the more exposed they would become. The world around them was full of potential threats, and she couldn't ignore the fact that, sooner or later, those threats would come for her and Zion. As Laia and Grayson sat together beneath the stars one quiet evening, she found herself contemplating the future. She had once thought that her life was already written for her, that she was doomed to wander the stars with only Zion by her side. But now, with Grayson beside her, she began to wonder if there was more to life than loneliness and fear. "We'll face it together," Grayson said, as though reading her thoughts. "No matter what comes our way, we'll face it together." And in that moment, Laia knew that her world was changing. Slowly but surely, the walls around her heart were beginning to fall. Maybe, just maybe, she could have the companionship she had always longed for. With Zion by her side and Grayson walking beside her, she could finally believe that the impossible might be within reach. The path ahead was uncertain, but Laia was no longer afraid. Together, they would face the world, and whatever dangers it might throw at them.